He is the Senior VP and Senior Policy Director, Marc Goldwein. He joins us via telephone. Marc, good morning. You're on with Rob and Bill and John. Great to have you, sir.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
You're quite welcome. Where do we find you? Are you in D.C. this morning?
I am, and it's a beautiful day.
Yeah, very nice. We're not that far outside of D.C. here in the eastern Panhandle part of West Virginia, so it's
depends on the time of day,
so to speak,
and who your luncheon guests are.
I guess I might make a point on that too. So let's talk about the federal budget and what Congress is doing right now as an effort to reduce the deficit and the debt. Marc, your review of what you've seen so far in January, February, March, and 3 weeks of April of 2025.
Well, look, the federal budget's in real bad shape. We're borrowing $2 trillion per year. Debt is as large as the economy. It's never been that high since World War II. Interest cost on the debt is now our second largest budget item. It costs more than Medicare, more than defense. So I wish I could tell you Congress was taking this seriously and trying to reverse course before we get into a debt spiral. But actually what we're seeing is exactly the opposite. Yes, there are forays towards reducing spending in some areas, maybe some revenue from tariffs. But overall, what Congress is trying to do is actually add to the debt. And the fight is between the House of Representatives that wants to add $2.8 trillion to the debt over a decade and the Senate that wants to add $5.8 trillion.
So we are in cut mode, it would seem. Are we making actual cuts, or when we make a cut, are we replacing it with spending someplace else?
Right. Well, so we have two places we're cutting. One is the DOGE, right? And so far, most of their cuts have been to relatively small contracts, but there's some big savings, I think, that will materialize from the workforce reduction. Those take time because we're still paying the federal workers out. So there could be big savings there. But when I say big savings, I mean $100 billion, not, over $100 billion a year when fully phased in at the high end, not the $1 trillion that Elon Musk says we want. And then there's Congress that's talking about spending cuts, and they're talking about some cuts in Medicaid and higher education and food stamps and other kind of welfare benefits, especially going after fraud, waste, abuse, and sort of excessive things put in the Biden administration. But every dollar of those cuts is going to go into another spending increase or another tax cut. And not only that, it's not going to be enough to cover it. And so that's why the fight is, are they going to borrow $2.8 trillion on top of those cuts, or are they going to borrow $5.8 trillion on top of those cuts? That's what the House and Senate are fighting over. Not who's going to reduce the debt more, but who's going to borrow more.
I think most Americans think that the DOGE cuts, along with some other proposed cuts to programs, are done with the goal of balancing the budget. And what it sounds like you're describing is these cuts will just lessen the increase in the deficit that the country has. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's right. And look, I think that's okay. We don't need to get to balance. What we need to get is to a point that the deficit's small enough that we can grow our way out of the debt, that the debt shrinks relative to the economy. The problem is the DOGE cuts aren't even going to do that. And again, Congress is trying to make things worse at the same time DOGE is trying to make them better. But if we had, Secretary of Treasury talked about deficits of 3% of GDP, which is very similar to the $1 trillion Elon Musk has talked about. If we got deficits down to that level, I know that seems like an awful lot of money, and it is, but we could start to get the debt on a sustainable path because our economic growth would take over at that point.
Is there a way out of this spending issue without serious cuts to those third rail issues like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security?
You can't solve this without looking at the four largest spending programs: Social Security, Medicare, Defense, Medicaid. You just can't. That's where all the money is. But you don't have to go after benefits. In Medicare, there is a tremendous amount of waste where we are overpaying for services. We're paying more for the exact same service at a hospital versus a doctor's clinic, for example. In Medicaid, there's a tremendous amount of waste where states are basically tricking the federal government to pay them more money than they're entitled under the intent of the law. In Social Security, benefits are growing every year, including for very high earners that don't need them. We don't need to be giving any couple $2 million of Social Security benefits over their lifetime. But that's where the program's heading if we don't make some changes. And so no, we cannot ignore those programs, but we don't have to make any kind of deep cuts. We just have to make smart reforms.
Bill.
Yeah, good morning, Mark. It's frequently said that with a tax cut, it will pay for itself. You're saying that's not going to be the case, correct?
No, look, if you cut the tax rate from 90% to 80%, that's probably going to pay for itself because you've doubled somebody's take-home pay and you get to keep 80%. But cutting the tax rate from 39% to 37%, it just doesn't do the trick. There's tons of estimates out there from groups from pretty far right to far left. They basically think extending the tax cuts will pay for somewhere between 1% and 16% of themselves. So it'll pay for some of it, but not most of it, not even that much of it. 16% to the high end. Let's even double that. It still means 2/3 of it needs to be paid for some other way, spending cuts or more debt.
Okay. Related to the extending the tax cut, does that come before or after some of the congressional spending cuts in other areas?
Well, probably before. We haven't seen the bill yet. All we've seen is the numbers, and we don't even have agreement on that. But probably the tax cuts would start first in many cases because spending cuts will take some time to phase in. Or they might start at the same time, but the spending cuts will probably start slower.
So we're kind of betting on the come. We're going to be doing the tax cuts for extension of tax cuts first, and then wait until somewhere down the line to determine what the spending cuts will be. Is that correct?
Well, look, we hopefully will decide on them at the same time, but they'll go into effect at different times.
Okay.
And look, that's bad, but the worst part is the spending cuts aren't going to cover the tax cuts. They're not going to cover half the tax cuts. The House wants to cut $2 trillion to pay for $4.8 trillion. The Senate wants to cut $4 billion to pay for $5.8 trillion. That math just doesn't work.
John Gilstrap.
Good morning, Mark. I can't do this math in my head, but it makes sense to me that when Social Security was first passed, as I understand it anecdotally, the benefits started at age 65 at a time when life expectancy was like 66. And now the benefits still start at 65, and life expectancy has obviously expanded a great deal.
That's actually kind of somewhat true. You can get them at 62. You know, 67 is full benefits for most people now.
And 70
is the maxed out
is the
benefit.
big payoff. Yeah. So if we told today's 30-year-olds or 40-year-olds that, okay, that 62 is now moved to 65, and the 65 is now moved to 70. You know, if we shift those age brackets, intuitively, it seems to me that there's close to $1 trillion in savings right there. Has anybody looked at that?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of raising the retirement age, not only because people are living longer, but also because it actually encourages people to delay their retirement, which it turns out is good for the economy and in most cases is good for the worker. But the thing is, those savings accrue slowly. I mean, you mentioned today's 30-year-olds. They're not going to be 70 for 40 more years. We wouldn't get any savings in the first 40 years in that case, and then they'd accumulate slowly. And so I'm a big fan of raising the retirement age. I think that should be part of a solution on Social Security, but it won't come fast enough to avoid Social Security insolvency, which is actually coming 8 years from now in 2033.
Joe Biden had a plan at one point. As everybody knows, Social Security caps out at a number every year. That number goes up based on inflation and some other things that they factor into that. So I think the cap this year is somewhere around, give or take, $170,000.
Contributions, you mean?
Yeah, you stop having Social Security taxes withdrawn from your paycheck after you hit that cap. Biden had a plan to have them kick in again around $400,000. Is there any serious discussion in Congress right now to raise the Social Security cap, regardless of inflation, to a higher number?
Yeah, so look, I'm not a fan of those donut holes where you pay, then you stop paying, and then you pay again. But I do think that raising that cap ought to be on the table. To fix Social Security, we're going to sort of need an all-of-the-above approach. We're going to need to look at that cap. We're going to need to look at the retirement age. We're going to need to look at the benefit formula, whether we're measuring inflation rate and the cost of living adjustment. Now, you asked, is there any serious discussions? And I'm sad to say to you, the answer is no. As right now, everybody in Congress, Democrats, Republicans, have their head in the sand. They just figure they'll deal with this later. But time is running out. We got 8 years. Social Security is projected to run out when today's youngest retirees turn 70. And meanwhile, Congress is just talking about more spending and tax cuts. They're ignoring Social Security altogether.
Do you think the tax cuts should be allowed to expire, Mark?
My ideal would be what someone described to me as strategic extension, to extend the good parts, to let the bad parts expire, to modify the in-between parts, and to add some pay-for. So that's my preference. But if the choice is between expire and extend, look, extending them is $4 trillion added to the debt at a time that our debt is already rising out of control. I would take the hit and let them expire if it's stuck with that binary choice.
Okay, Ho, you've introduced a couple of new terms, definitions. What would be a good part and what would be a bad part of the? Yeah.
So something I think that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did really well is it simplified the tax code. It by capping the SALT deduction, increasing the standard deduction, getting rid of the personal exemption, expanding the child tax credit, and getting rid of the alternative minimum tax. I know I threw a lot of things at you, but there's this whole package of reforms that just makes the tax code easier for everybody. I would keep that package generally. One other thing it did that made the tax code much more complicated is it created a special deduction that's meant for small businesses, the 199A, but mostly actually ends up benefiting owners of pretty large businesses and ends up causing a lot of extra time for tax prep and a lot of gaming where people reclassify their income. So I'd either let that expire or I'd reform it seriously so it actually focuses on business investment.
Okay.
Can you take?
Okay, yeah. This is all political, we know. But the tariffs, how will that impact these decisions going to be made in the next couple of months?
Well, look, because the tariffs, let me say there's two economic issues related to the tariffs. The one is the tariffs themselves, which should cause a reduction in trade, especially with the response. And the second is the tariff uncertainty. And that's maybe the bigger impediment right now for trade because a lot of businesses are just waiting. They're just waiting to get some certainty on the tariffs. And so next couple of months, I expect the tariffs to have a very large sort of standstill effect on trades where businesses pull from inventories and they wait to see how things clear up. And then long term, it's going to depend on what the tariffs look like. But either way, if there's any large tariffs remaining, expect prices are going to go up and expect we're going to be buying more stuff here and less stuff from abroad where they can make it at a discount. Also, we're going to be selling less stuff to abroad.
The latest report from Customs was that we were collecting $500 million a day in tariff taxes. I don't know if that report was above and beyond what we used to, or if that's just the total amount we are collecting right now.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that number for a moment as it projects over the course of an entire year, and let's just say that $500 million a day is new money. Is there enough there to knock, because President Trump's goal is to have that tariff money pay for the tax cuts along with the cuts in the federal government? Is that math working out in any way?
It's not. So estimates I've seen is that over 10 years, if the current tariffs stay in effect, it'll be about $2 trillion. That's actually a decent share. If we go with the House bill, that is about $3 trillion. That's most of it. If we go with the Senate bill, it's a third of it. So it's a decent share. But what we're actually seeing is that the money that's coming in is much lower than expected. And that $2 trillion number doesn't account for a lot of the negative economic effects, not only on output and so taxes, but also it turns out on interest rates. We're seeing interest rates go up. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see a much lower number than that, maybe closer to $1 trillion. And look, $1 trillion over 10 years is still a good amount of money, and I'll take it. But there's probably more efficient ways to raise it, and it's not going to be enough to cover the tax cuts, at least not by itself.
What's the answer here? Because everything that you do in your life is taxed already. There is nothing you can do that isn't taxed. And if we're taxing everything we can possibly tax and we're still not raising enough money, I don't understand how you get out of this, except to tax it more and to spend less. But when you spend less, everyone says cut waste, fraud, and abuse, but so far I haven't seen any evidence that we're really seriously making a dent on cutting waste, fraud, and abuse.
We got rid of the IGs.
Yeah, we got rid of the Inspector Generals.
Look, there's a $2 trillion a year gap between what we bring in taxes and what we spend. We don't need to eliminate that, but let's say we should probably cut that in half, at least. And I think we do it on two sides of the budget. On the one hand, we got to get our spending under control. And that starts with health care, where there's actually a tremendous amount of waste and opportunity. It also means waste, fraud, and abuse, as you said, but it also means some really hard choices and what we want and what we don't want. And then we should look at on the tax side. And I'm not a big fan of raising tax rates. Like, if we need the money, I'll do it. But where I would look is the tax breaks, because we have a lot of tax expenditures, a lot of spending through the tax code that actually creates a lot of bad decision making. So, for example, when we give people a big break on their health care, it drives up the cost of health care. The mortgage interest deduction encourages people to borrow more for bigger homes instead of, encouraging home ownership as intended. There's workarounds where we got this cap on the SALT deduction, but people have figured out in California and New York, if you just call your income business income, you can avoid it, right? So I would go after those kinds of things first, see if we can clean up the code, actually get people to make more efficient decisions and bring in more revenue in the process. At the same time, we are seriously tackling the spending side of the budget.
You had mentioned, and you might have actually said this number already, but I was writing something else at the time. There is a point of deficit. There's a number that we can handle and grow our way out of. And forgive me for that sentence. What is that number?
Yes, so I think the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Investment, has said 3% of GDP, and that's about right. The actual number depends on what your interest rate is and what your growth rate is. It's a complicated formula. But if we can get down to 3% of GDP, which is just south of $1 trillion, we would be in a decent position right now.
So this is the depressing part of this. And Rob, you asked, how do you get out of this? The House and the Senate are more than happy, and we're the benefactors of it here in West Virginia. We get a lot of federal money into this state. So the kind people of Wyoming and Utah and California, a lot of their tax dollars are coming for very West Virginia centric things, just as our tax money is going to others. If we could stop that, if we could stop federal spending for state programs, a lot of this problem would go away. West Virginia would suffer horribly as a result. So it's not something we want, but it seems to me there's a Gordian knot here that can't be untied. Am I wrong?
Well, look, we don't have to. I actually saw a great paper recently that showed that you could attribute all the recent growth in federal spending to state or state-like programs. But you don't have to get rid of them. For example, in Medicaid, we don't have to stop the federal government paying for Medicaid. The federal government just should start paying what it intends. Right now, there's this scam that every single state, except for Alaska, plays, where they go to a hospital and they say, look, we know we owe you $100, but how about if we pay you $150 and we tax you $50 or we tax you $40? That way we get to report a higher cost to the federal government and we get to collect more money. It's basically legalized money laundering. And if we just close some of those games, we can afford to pay the states what we intend to pay them. It's this extra that the states are essentially scamming to the federal government that I would seriously go after.
If you know about this, and they know about this, why don't they do something about this?
And it was a large article in the Washington Post this past week about it. So,
yeah, look, everybody knows about it, but there's two reasons they don't want to do it. The one is that the states have a very powerful lobby, and they say, well, we still like the money. And the second is that they make sort of the stealing bread for your family argument. Sure, this is ill-gotten money that we didn't deserve under the program, but we need it to cover Medicaid beneficiaries. We need it to cover low income. That's the argument they make. There's maybe some truth to that, but it's only because the states have become so addicted to this process. And so I think the solution to that is maybe you don't ban it overnight. Maybe you phase it out over a 10 or 15-year period. Give states time to find new revenue sources. But the idea that we should keep letting them scam money out of the federal government forever is just hard for me to understand.
Marc, you've given us a lot of information this morning. If you were king for the day, if you could influence Congress, what are the first one or two steps you would take?
I would look at retirement ages across the board, not just in Social Security, but in the tax code, the regulatory code, and Medicare, and figure out how to get those right so we're giving people the best incentives possible to work and save the federal government money. That's number one. Number two, I would go after some of the most egregious tax breaks. I've mentioned a few of them here, the SALT cap, the mortgage, the 199A, that are really distorting behavior. And number three, which maybe should have been number one, we got to get healthcare costs down. And don't make me pick one way to do it because I have 20. But if I'm going to be forced, I would say the Medicare Advantage program, which is sort of the private alternative to Medicare, it's actually more efficient than Medicare, and yet it costs the federal government way more money because of some kind of complicated rules that we could fix and save everybody a boatload of dollars.
Did you say Advantage costs the federal government way more money and it's more efficient, or Medicare costs the government way more money?
Medicare Advantage is more efficient than traditional Medicare, and yet it costs the federal government more money because the private plans sort of take that extra efficiency. They share it a little bit with the beneficiaries as low premiums instead of using it to help the taxpayer.
I see. I'm told many of these medically related, it could be people who deal with seniors, people who deal with disabilities, that there's a lot of upcoding that goes on with billing so that they can get a better reimbursement rate than what the reimbursement rate would be if you honestly reported what the treatment was. I'm told that this is quite routine. I don't know it for a fact. This is what I'm told. Okay, so
that's exactly right. You're very learned.
All right, very good. Thank you. Whoever told me that was accurate. So when Doge was created, this is what I thought we were going after when we talked about eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse. Not wiping out cancer research grants and entire departments of people who were doing work, right? And I've seen very little of evidence that this is what they've been going after. Have you seen anything otherwise to indicate that this is actually what that's part of the cutting of waste, fraud, and abuse that they're going after?
My little defense will be they do seem to be looking at sort of tagging of stuff. In other words, tagging in computer systems and making sure they're classifying things right. And that could maybe trickle down to this stuff. That's my little defense to say that generally I agree with you. The big waste is in what you just upcoding. The big waste is in the estate scams. The big waste is in site nurture. Most of the big waste is in healthcare. And what isn't in healthcare is mostly in defense, frankly. And that is not where I've seen Doge putting most of their efforts.
Yeah. See, because to me, Doge is a gigantic waste of taxpayer dollars because you can eliminate departments without hiring extra people to do it. You just walk in and go, all right, this whole department's gone. You're out. I didn't need 20 Doge bros to come in to do that, getting paid at the 1510 GS level. We could have done that without their expertise. I thought their expertise was going in and deciphering contracts and finding out where the waste, fraud, and abuse was. Where is the upbilling that's going on? Where is the fraudulent person that's collecting benefits? That sort of thing. But I'm not seeing a lot of that. I don't want to beat the horse again.
That's right. I think they've done I think they've done a little bit of it. I think, for example, they figured out agencies that have software subscriptions and they're not actually using them. And that was a good use of Doge's time because the agencies weren't finding that on their own. So I think they're doing a little of it. But generally, I agree with you. Most of what Doge is doing isn't actually efficiency. It's actually just cuts.
It's just firing people.
And O&B could have done that.
Hey, we're just about out of time here, Mark. Where can people find out more about a committee for responsible federal budget?
Oh, check out crfb.org. Not only is all of our papers and stuff there, but we have a lot of interactive tools, including one where you can go through the tax code and decide exactly what you want to extend and how you want to do it.
Good stuff. This is the second time we've had somebody on this year from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, and you guys are pretty impressive people. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Mark.
Have a good day.